In the heart of Umakara village lived Ekene, a young man known for his daring nature and boundless confidence. He was tall and strong, with a quick wit and a penchant for mocking the elders' wisdom. While others revered the stories of Ebe Nogbuo, the graveyard shrouded in mystery, Ekene dismissed them as mere fabrications to instill fear. Ekene had built a reputation for taking on impossible dares. From climbing the tallest Iroko trees to hunting in forbidden forests, he always returned unscathed, chest puffed with pride. His victories had earned him admiration from some and scorn from others, particularly the village elders, who saw his arrogance as a dangerous flaw. The story of Ekene the Bold gained its momentum on that fateful evening by the village bonfire, a tradition in Imwakara for storytelling and community bonding. It was a time when the elders shared tales of the past, often laden with moral lessons. But for the younger generation, it was also an opportunity to challenge those lessons, questioning their truth and, sometimes, making light of the warnings. Ekene, who relished attention, thrived on these nights. He had grown tired of the repetitive tales of spirits, curses, and ancient warnings. To him, they were nothing more than tools to keep the village in fear. Elders, he began loudly, interrupting an old man's tale about the graveyard. How can grown men and women believe such nonsense? Ebe Nogbuo is just a place for old bones. All this talk of curses is for cowards. His bold words drew murmurs from the crowd. The elders exchanged glances, unsure whether to rebuke him or let his arrogance speak for itself. But before they could respond, one of Ekene's friends, Obi, who often teased him for his ego, decided to set him up for a challenge he couldn't refuse. Obi turned to Ekene, his voice dripping with mockery. If you're so fearless, why not prove it? Go to Ebe Nogbuo tonight and retrieve the brass bell of Izenwa. Show everyone here that you're braver than the spirits they fear. The crowd gasped collectively at Obi's words. Even the most daring of villagers avoided mentioning the brass bell. It was believed to be one of the most cursed artifacts in the village's history. The bell of Izenwa was no ordinary object. Izenwa, the first priest of the village, had been both revered and feared. He had used the bell in rituals to summon and bind spirits, calling on their aid in times of need. But over time, the power of the bell became too great, and Izenwa was said to have misused it, trapping not only spirits but the souls of the innocent within its golden chime. When Izenwa died, the villagers, fearing the power of the bell, buried it with him in Ebe Nogbuo, believing that the soil of the cursed graveyard would contain its influence. The bell was sealed with rituals and incantations, with strict warnings never to disturb it. For generations, the bell remained undisturbed, and its legend grew darker. It was said that anyone who touched the bell would hear the voices of the trapped souls, begging for release, and they would be cursed to join them. Ekene's pride would not allow him to back down. He smirked at Obi's challenge and stood up. The bell of Izenwa. That's what you're all afraid of. Fine. I'll bring it back and prove once and for all that your stories are nothing but tales for children. The crowd erupted in protest. The elders, alarmed by his boldness, stepped forward. Ekene, you don't understand the forces you're tampering with, said Elder Adana, her voice shaking with urgency. That bell is not of this world. It was sealed for a reason. If you disturb it, you will bring doom upon yourself and this village. But Ekene only laughed. You've told these stories for so long that you've started believing them. I'll be back before dawn, and when I return, you'll all see that there's nothing to fear. Obi, sensing the gravity of the situation, tried to backtrack. Ekene, it was just a joke. You don't have to. Too late, Obi, Ekene interrupted. I've already accepted your challenge. Backing out now would make me a coward, wouldn't it? The village fell silent. The flames of the bonfire flickered, as if even they recoiled from the challenge Ekene had just accepted. Ekene set off to prepare for his journey. Despite his bravado, there was a part of him that felt uneasy. The silence of the crowd, the warnings of the elders, and even Obi's nervous demeanor lingered in his mind. But his pride overshadowed his doubt. He armed himself with a lantern, a small shovel, and a flask of palm wine, muttering to himself, "It's just a graveyard. What's the worst that could happen?" As he walked through the village toward the forest path leading to Ebe Nogbuo, a few curious onlookers followed from a distance, whispering among themselves about his foolishness. An elder woman, known for her visions, called out to him from her hut. "Ekene, stop now, before it's too late. The spirits are already watching you." But Ekene ignored her. He had become the center of attention, and his pride demanded he go through with the dare. Behind him, Obi and the other youths whispered nervously. Though Obi had set the dare in motion, he didn't truly believe Ekene would take it seriously. "He's too stubborn," one of them said. "What if he actually disturbs something?" Obi, now riddled with guilt, sighed. "I didn't think he'd go this far. I thought he'd laugh it off." "What if he doesn't come back?" another asked. "He'll come back," Obi said, though his tone lacked confidence. "He always does." As Ekene entered the dark forest that led to Ebe Nogbuo, the weight of the dare began to settle on him. The path was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves absent. The stories of the graveyard crept into his thoughts, no matter how hard he tried to push them away. The dare, which had seemed like an opportunity to prove his courage, now felt like a mistake. But his pride kept him moving forward. He had made a promise to return with the brass bell, and nothing, not even fear, would stop him. As the graveyard came into view, Ekene took a deep breath. The air was cold and still, and the moonlight barely penetrated the canopy of trees. His lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the graves. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper carried on the wind, "Turn back." But Ekene, clutching his shovel, muttered under his breath, "This is just a dare. Nothing more." He stepped into Ebe Nogbuo, unaware that he had just sealed his fate. As Ekene stepped into the dreaded Ebe Nogbuo, the very air seemed to change. It was heavier, colder, and laced with an eerie silence. The once crisp sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, chopping insects, and distant hoot of owls were completely absent, as though the graveyard existed in a separate realm, cut off from the natural world. Even the glow of his lantern seemed muted, barely illuminating the ground before him. The graves were old, the headstones cracked and weathered by time. Many bore strange markings, symbols and patterns that were neither words nor images, but something in between. The villagers whispered that these symbols were the work of the spirits themselves, etched as warnings to trespassers. For the first time, Ekene hesitated. But pride and the weight of the dare pushed him forward. Deep in the center of the graveyard lay the grave of Ezenwa, the first priest of Umuakara. It was unmistakable, a massive stone slab adorned with intricate carvings of snakes, the sun, and other esoteric symbols. Surrounding the grave were remnants of decayed offerings, clay pots, broken beads, and wilted flowers that villagers had once left to appease the spirits. The grave exuded an unnatural chill, and as Ekene approached, he noticed that the air grew even heavier, pressing against his chest like an unseen force. The lantern flickered violently as if trying to extinguish itself. For a moment, Ekene felt a pang of doubt. The warnings of the elders, the whispers in the wind, the eerie silence, all of it came rushing back to him. But Ekene was not one to back down. "It's just a stone and some dirt," he muttered to himself, gripping his shovel tightly. With a deep breath, he plunged the blade into the soil. As he began to dig, the ground resisted him. Unlike the soft soil of the surrounding graves, Ezenwa's grave felt alive. The earth was dense and unyielding, as though it didn't want to be disturbed. Each scoop of dirt felt heavier than the last, and every strike of the shovel echoed unnaturally in the still air. After several minutes, Ekene's arms ached, and sweat dripped from his brow despite the cold. But his persistence paid off. The blade of his shovel struck something hard, a sound that reverberated through the ground like a low growl. Excitement mixed with fear as he brushed away the remaining dirt to reveal the brass bell of Izenwa. The bell was unlike anything Ekene had ever seen. It shimmered faintly in the weak lantern light, its surface etched with intricate, spiraling patterns that seemed to move and shift as he stared at them. The brass was warm to the touch, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. At the very top of the bell was a handle carved to resemble a snake devouring its tail, a symbol of eternity. But the most unnerving feature was the faint sound it emitted. Though Ekene hadn't rung it, the bell seemed to hum softly, almost as if it were alive. The hum grew louder as he held it, resonating deep within his chest. As soon as Ekene lifted the bell from the grave, the ground beneath him trembled. A cold wind swept through the graveyard, extinguishing his lantern and plunging him into darkness. The faint hum of the bell turned into a low, guttural moan, followed by whispers, soft at first, then growing louder. "Return it," the voices hissed. "Return what you have taken." Ekene froze, gripping the bell tightly. The whispers grew into a chorus, overlapping and echoing in the cold night air. The ground beneath him shifted, and faint tendrils of mist began to rise from the soil. The mist coiled and twisted, taking the shape of shadowy figures with glowing eyes. Panic set in, but Ekene forced himself to move. "This is just my imagination," he muttered, trying to calm his racing heart. "It's just a stupid bell." But as he turned to leave, the shadows moved closer, their whispers growing louder. "You were warned," they hissed. "You disturbed the rest of the forgotten." As Ekene unearthed the brass bell of Izenwa, the air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness enveloped the graveyard. His fingers trembled as he touched the bell's surface, warm to the touch despite the chilling night air. The patterns etched into the brass shimmered faintly, almost as if they were alive, twisting and shifting under the flickering lantern light. Ekene's bravado wavered as he stared at the artifact. Something about the bell felt deeply wrong, but he shook off the unease. "It's just an object," he muttered. "Nothing more." But the moment he lifted the bell out of the grave, the earth trembled beneath his feet. The once firm ground felt unstable, shifting like waves on an unseen ocean. His lantern flickered violently before the flame was snuffed out entirely, plunging him into total darkness. A cold wind surged through the graveyard, carrying with it a faint hum, a sound that seemed to come from the bell itself. The hum grew louder, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very air around him. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world, a sound that seemed to awaken something ancient and malevolent. Whispers began to echo in the darkness, soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the bell. But as Ekene strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, overlapping and multiplying until they became an unintelligible cacophony. The voices spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but the anger and sorrow in their tone were unmistakable. "Why have you disturbed us?" one voice hissed, clear and sharp, cutting through the chaos. Ekene froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice didn't sound like it came from any living being. It was cold, disembodied, and carried an ancient weight that made his knees tremble. The graveyard, once silent and still, began to change. From the disturbed soil of Izenwa's grave, a faint mist began to rise. At first, it was thin and almost translucent, but it quickly grew thicker, coiling and twisting like a living thing. The mist spread across the ground, covering the graves and surrounding Ekene in a ghostly fog. Out of the mist, dark shapes began to form. They were humanoid but featureless, their bodies made of shadow that flickered and wavered like smoke in the wind. Their eyes, however, were piercing, glowing red orbs that seemed to burn with anger. One by one, the figures rose from the ground, their forms silent but menacing. They moved closer, their glowing eyes fixed on Ekene. "Return what you have taken." The command echoed from all directions, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. Ekene stumbled backward, clutching the bell tightly. His chest heaved as panic set in. The shadows moved closer, their cold, spectral hands reaching out for him. The whispers turned into guttural growls, reverberating through the graveyard like the roar of an unseen storm. The ground beneath Ekene's feet shifted again, but this time it felt alive. The soil pulsed like a heartbeat, rising and falling as though the earth itself were breathing. The once solid ground became soft and unstable, pulling at his boots as though trying to swallow him whole. Roots from the nearby trees began to writhe, twisting and coiling toward him like serpents. One root wrapped around his ankle, and he screamed, kicking it away. The shadows laughed, a low, chilling sound that made his blood run cold. "You cannot escape," they whispered. "You are ours now." The brass bell in Ekene's hands began to vibrate. It rang softly, not from any motion of his own, but as if it had a will of its own. The sound was low and mournful, carrying a strange resonance that made the air around him ripple. The patterns on the bell's surface glowed faintly, the golden etchings pulsating in time with the whispers. Ekene tried to throw the bell away, but his hands wouldn't obey. His fingers clung to the artifact as though it had fused with his skin. The bell's vibration intensified, and its hum grew louder, drowning out the whispers and the growls. The sound was deafening, filling Ekene's mind with an unbearable pressure. "You dared to awaken us," the shadows hissed. "Now you will pay the price." As the shadows closed in, the bell's glow became blinding. The patterns on its surface unraveled, spinning outward like threads of golden light that wrapped around the grave. The air above the grave shimmered and warped, creating a swirling void of darkness that seemed to pull light and sound into it. The shadows bowed toward the void, their movements reverent and obedient, as if the portal were their master. Ekene stared in horror as the portal grew larger, its edges crackling with golden and black energy. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, emanating from the portal itself. "Time is up." The shadows lunged at Ekene, their cold hands gripping his arms and legs. He struggled, but their strength was overwhelming. They began to drag him toward the portal, their voices now chanting in unison, "Join us! Join us! Join us!" Ekene's scream echoed through the graveyard as the shadows pulled him closer to the void. The bell, still clutched in his hands, floated into the air, spinning slowly as it rang one final, mournful chime. The portal's pull grew stronger, and Ekene's body was lifted off the ground, his limbs flailing helplessly. "Please, let me go," he cried, tears streaming down his face. But his pleas were met with silence. As he was pulled into the void, the shadows disappeared, melting back into the mist. The bell, now glowing faintly, fell back into the grave. The portal collapsed with a deafening roar, and the graveyard fell silent once more. The story of Ekene the Bold became a cautionary tale, told to every child in Umuakara. The once lively young man who laughed at danger had become a tragic figure, his arrogance and greed leading to his doom. Ebe Nogbuo remained a place of fear and reverence. No one dared approach it, especially after dark. And on quiet nights, the villagers claimed they could hear the faint chime of the brass bell, a haunting reminder of the price of ignoring the wisdom of the elders. When the villagers came the next morning, the grave was sealed as though nothing had happened. The bell lay half buried in the soil, its glow extinguished. But the air around Ezemo's grave felt different, heavier, colder, and charged with an energy that made even the bravest among them shudder. The whispers of the awakening never truly faded. On quiet nights, the villagers claimed they could still hear the faint chime of the bell and the mournful cries of Ekene, forever bound to the grave he had dared to disturb.